It took exactly 5 minutes and 31 seconds. That's how long Jasmine Crockett's response to Chief Justice John Roberts' unqualified insult lasted. In those 5 minutes, she exposed 18 years of ethical violations and triggered the biggest scandal in American judicial history. What started as a routine congressional oversight hearing exploded into a constitutional crisis that would forever change how Americans viewed their highest court. Roberts thought he could silence her with institutional authority and legal intimidation, but he had no idea that for 2 years, Jasmine had been quietly building a case that would shake the Supreme Court to its very foundations. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Hart Senate Office building had never felt more like a cathedral of democracy than on the morning of November 15th. The Senate Judiciary Committee's oversight hearing on Supreme Court ethics and transparency had been months in the making, prompted by growing public concern about undisclosed gifts, luxury travel, and potential conflicts of interest among the justices. Room 216 was packed beyond capacity. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by constitutional law scholars, ethics experts, journalists, and concerned citizens who understood they were witnessing a rare moment of accountability in American governance. The Supreme Court, for all its power and influence, was rarely subjected to direct congressional oversight, protected by traditions of judicial independence that had allowed it to operate with minimal public scrutiny for decades. At the witness table sat Chief Justice John Roberts, looking every inch the embodiment of judicial authority he had become over his 18 years leading the nation's highest court. At 69, Roberts possessed the kind of institutional gravitas that made him seem less like a government employee and more like a living symbol of American justice itself. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his black suit was impeccably tailored, and his bearing radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged by any branch of government. He had agreed to testify voluntarily, a decision his advisors had recommended as a way to demonstrate the court's commitment to transparency while controlling the narrative around recent ethics controversies. Behind him sat a phalanx of Supreme Court staff, clerks, administrative officials, and legal advisors who had spent weeks preparing him for what they expected would be a respectful, deferential hearing. After all, Congress had always treated the Chief Justice with something approaching reverence, recognizing that challenging the court too aggressively could be seen as an attack on judicial independence itself. On the committee dais, senators from both parties had prepared their questions carefully. Republicans were expected to offer Roberts softball questions that would allow him to explain the court's position on ethics issues. Democrats would be more critical, but their questions would likely focus on process and procedure rather than personal misconduct. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine sat at the far end of the Democratic side of the dais, a manila folder closed in front of her, her expression unreadable. She had been appointed to the Judiciary Committee only 8 months earlier, and many in the Washington establishment still viewed her as a junior member who was unlikely to play a major role in such a high-profile hearing. They had no idea what she had been working on for the past 2 years. Ever since Roberts had made several controversial decisions that seemed to benefit wealthy donors and corporate interests, Jasmine had been conducting her own investigation into the Chief Justice's financial relationships and potential conflicts of interest. She had reached out to ethics experts, reviewed thousands of pages of financial disclosure forms, and most importantly, obtained documents that revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond anything that had been publicly reported. The folder in front of her contained evidence that could destroy not just Roberts' reputation, but public confidence in the Supreme Court itself. But Jasmine had been patient, waiting for the right moment to present her findings in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Today was that moment. The hearing began with the kind of elaborate courtesies that characterized congressional interactions with the judicial branch. Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley opened with effusive praise for Roberts' service and an acknowledgement of the vital importance of judicial independence. Ranking Member Dick Durbin struck a more critical tone, but was careful to frame his concerns in terms of institutional reform rather than personal criticism. For the first hour, the questioning proceeded exactly as Roberts' team had anticipated. Republican senators asked him to explain the court's existing ethics guidelines and to respond to what they characterized as unfair attacks on judicial integrity. Roberts answered with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in high-stakes legal arguments, his responses hitting all the talking points his staff had prepared. "Senator," he said in response to a question about gift disclosure requirements, "the Supreme Court takes its ethical obligations extremely seriously. We have robust internal procedures for reviewing potential conflicts of interest, and every justice is committed to maintaining the highest standards of judicial conduct." It was a perfectly crafted non-answer that sounded substantive while revealing nothing specific about the court's actual practices. Democratic senators pressed harder, asking about specific instances where justices had failed to recuse themselves from cases involving their financial interests or personal relationships. But even their questions were couched in the kind of respectful language that acknowledged Roberts's elevated status in the constitutional system. "Mr. Chief Justice," Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said carefully, "while we respect the independence of the judiciary, don't you think the American people deserve more transparency about the financial relationships that might influence judicial decision-making?" Roberts' response was smooth and authoritative. "Senator Whitehouse, I believe the current system strikes the appropriate balance between transparency and the need to protect judicial independence. We must be careful not to subject the judiciary to political pressures that could compromise our ability to make decisions based solely on the law." It was the kind of answer that had allowed Roberts to deflect criticism for years, invoking judicial independence as a shield against accountability, while offering vague assurances about ethical conduct. But as the morning wore on, Jasmine remained silent, taking notes and occasionally glancing at the manila folder in front of her. Several times, Chairman Grassley offered her the opportunity to ask questions, but she politely declined, saying she preferred to wait until later in the hearing. Roberts, if he noticed her at all, probably assumed she was simply inexperienced or intimidated by the gravity of questioning the Chief Justice of the United States. He had no idea that she was waiting for the perfect moment to spring a trap that had been 2 years in the making. It was during the afternoon session, after Roberts had successfully navigated 3 hours of questioning with his authority intact, that Jasmine finally made her move. The hearing had settled into a predictable rhythm of respectful questions and evasive answers, when Chairman Grassley, looking to wrap up the proceedings, offered Jasmine one final opportunity to question the Chief Justice. "Congresswoman Crockett," Grassley said, "would you like to use your remaining time for questions?" Jasmine looked up from her notes for the first time in hours, her expression still calm and unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," she said quietly. "I do have a few questions for the Chief Justice." She opened her manila folder with deliberate precision, the simple gesture somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as she pulled out the first document, a bank statement with the Supreme Court letterhead clearly visible. "Mr. Chief Justice," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed committee room, "I'd like to ask you about some financial arrangements that don't appear to have been properly disclosed in your annual ethics reports." Roberts straightened slightly in his chair. This wasn't the kind of question he had been expecting from a junior committee member, and the specificity of her language suggested she had access to information that concerned him. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone taking on a slight edge, "I'm not sure what specific arrangements you're referring to, but I can assure you that all of my financial relationships have been properly disclosed according to federal ethics requirements." Jasmine smiled slightly, an expression that somehow managed to be both respectful and deeply threatening. "I'm glad you mentioned federal ethics requirements, Mr. Chief Justice," she said, "because that's exactly what I'd like to discuss." She held up the bank statement, ensuring that the cameras could capture the Supreme Court letterhead. "This is a record of payments made to the Supreme Court Historical Society between 2019 and 2023. The Society received $2.8 million in donations from individuals and organizations that had cases pending before the court during that same period." The committee room fell silent. The Supreme Court Historical Society was supposed to be an independent organization that supported educational programs about the court, but Jasmine was suggesting something much more troubling. "The interesting thing about these donations," Jasmine continued, "is that according to internal emails I've obtained, many of them were solicited by court staff at the specific request of certain justices who wanted to reward donors with access to court events and private receptions. Roberts's face had gone pale. The existence of such emails would represent a massive breach of judicial ethics, suggesting that justices were essentially selling access to donors with business before the court. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice growing stronger, "were you aware that your wife Jane has been receiving consulting fees from the Supreme Court Historical Society for what internal documents describe as donor relationship management?" The question hit the committee room like a thunderclap. If true, it would mean that the Chief Justice's own family was financially benefiting from the court's relationship with donors who had business before the court. Roberts tried to respond, but Jasmine cut him off with a gesture. "Before you answer," she said, "let me be more specific. Mrs. Roberts has received $340,000 over the past 4 years for work that internal emails describe as ensuring donor satisfaction and maintaining appropriate relationships with major contributors." She held up another document, this one appearing to be an email with Jane Roberts's name clearly visible in the sender field. "According to this email from your wife to the Historical Society's development director, she specifically recommended that certain donors be invited to private court events because of their generous support and their potential value to pending cases." The implications were staggering. If the Chief Justice's wife was coordinating between donors and the court, it would represent the kind of corruption that could bring down the entire institution. But Roberts, drawing on decades of experience in high-pressure legal situations, tried to regain control of the narrative. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice now carrying unmistakable authority and irritation, "I find these accusations deeply troubling and inappropriate. The questions you're asking demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of judicial ethics and the proper relationship between Congress and the judiciary." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at Jasmine. "With all due respect, I don't believe you have the legal qualifications necessary to properly evaluate these complex ethical issues. Perhaps these questions would be better addressed by senators who have the experience and constitutional knowledge to understand the nuances of judicial independence." It was a devastating put-down, delivered with the full authority of his office. Roberts had just told a sitting member of Congress that she lacked the qualifications to question him, effectively dismissing her as an amateur who didn't understand how the system really worked. The committee room fell into stunned silence. Roberts had crossed a line that few government officials would dare to cross, directly challenging the authority of a congressional representative to conduct oversight of the judicial branch. But if Roberts thought he had successfully ended the line of questioning, he was catastrophically wrong. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still for a long moment after Roberts' dismissive response, her expression unreadable. The committee room remained silent, with senators and spectators alike waiting to see how she would respond to being so publicly dismissed by the Chief Justice. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried an undertone of steel that made everyone in the room lean forward to hear her words. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, "you're absolutely right about qualifications, so let me ask you about yours." She pulled another document from her manila folder, this one thicker than the others and bound with a black cover. "This is a report prepared by the Government Accountability Office at my request, detailing the financial relationships between Supreme Court justices and outside organizations over the past 5 years. She opened the report to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. "According to this analysis, you personally attended 47 events sponsored by organizations that had cases pending before the court during your tenure as Chief Justice. These weren't accidental encounters. These were planned, private events where you had direct contact with litigants and their representatives." Roberts tried to interrupt, but Jasmine continued without pausing. "At 23 of these events, you gave speeches or participated in panel discussions where you discussed legal issues that were directly relevant to cases pending before the court. The GAO found that in 18 instances, your public comments appeared to prejudge issues that came before the court within 6 months of your statements." The implications were staggering. If the Chief Justice was publicly discussing cases before they were decided, it would represent a fundamental breach of judicial ethics and due process. "But here's what really calls your qualifications into question, Mr. Chief Justice," Jasmine said, her voice growing stronger. "In every single instance where you made public comments that favored a particular legal position, The court subsequently ruled in favor of the position you had endorsed. She looked directly at Roberts, who was now staring at the documents in front of her with barely concealed panic. So when you question my qualifications to ask about judicial ethics, let me ask you about yours. What qualifies you to prejudge cases in public? Accept gifts from litigants and allow your family to profit from your position on the court? The committee room erupted in whispers and gasps. Jasmine had just accused the Chief Justice of the United States of systematic corruption, and she had the documentation to prove it, but she wasn't finished. Mr. Chief Justice, she continued, you mentioned constitutional knowledge. So let me ask you about your understanding of Article 3 of the Constitution, which requires federal judges to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. She pulled out yet another document, this one appearing to be a financial statement. This is a record of your family's financial holdings obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. It shows that you and your wife have received more than $1.2 million in gifts, payments, and benefits from individuals and organizations with business before the court. She looked up at Roberts, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. These payments weren't disclosed in your annual ethics reports despite federal law requiring such disclosure. In fact, according to ethics experts I've consulted, your failure to disclose these relationships represents the most serious breach of judicial ethics in the history of the Supreme Court. The weight of her words settled over the committee room like a heavy blanket. Jasmine had just accused the Chief Justice of corruption on a scale that dwarfed any previous Supreme Court scandal, and she still wasn't finished. Drawing on her preparation and the comprehensive documentation she had assembled, Jasmine methodically dismantled not just Roberts' personal conduct, but the entire system of influence and access that had grown up around the Supreme Court. Mr. Chief Justice, she said, consulting another document, let's talk about the Federalist Society donors who have provided you and other justices with luxury travel, private accommodations, and exclusive access to political figures. She held up what appeared to be a detailed travel itinerary. In August 2022, you accepted a trip to a private resort in Montana, paid for by the Koch network, where you spent 4 days in private meetings with conservative activists and major Republican donors. During that same trip, you gave a speech where you outlined your judicial philosophy on issues that were pending before the court. Roberts tried to respond, but Jasmine's presentation had gained momentum that seemed unstoppable. The total value of that trip was $47,000, far exceeding federal gift limits. But more importantly, 3 of the major donors you met with had cases that came before the court within 6 months of your visit. In all 3 cases, the court ruled in favor of positions that aligned with the political interests of your hosts. She turned to another section of her documentation. This pattern isn't isolated, Mr. Chief Justice. Over the past 5 years, you and other justices have accepted more than $4 million in undisclosed gifts, travel, and hospitality from individuals and organizations with direct interests in Supreme Court decisions. The numbers were staggering, painting a picture of a court that had become thoroughly corrupted by outside influence and money. But perhaps most troubling, Jasmine continued, is the evidence of direct coordination between your office and political operatives who were working to influence court decisions. She held up what appeared to be an email exchange. These emails, obtained through a whistleblower complaint filed with the Judicial Conference, show that your staff was in regular communication with conservative activists who were coordinating amicus briefs and public pressure campaigns designed to influence specific cases. Roberts, who had begun the hearing as the embodiment of judicial authority, now looked like a defendant at his own trial. In one particularly damaging email, Jasmine said, your chief of staff discusses messaging coordination with activists who were trying to build public support for overturning Roe v. Wade more than a year before the Dobbs case was decided. The revelation was explosive. If court staff were coordinating with outside activists on pending cases, it would represent the kind of political interference that undermined the entire basis of judicial independence. Mr. Chief Justice, Jasmine said, looking directly at Roberts, you questioned my qualifications to evaluate judicial ethics. But based on this evidence, I have to question whether you're qualified to serve on any court, let alone lead the highest court in the land. The atmosphere in the committee room had completely transformed. What had begun as a routine oversight hearing had become a constitutional crisis that threatened to bring down not just Roberts, but the entire Supreme Court. Roberts, faced with evidence he had never expected to see and accusations he had never prepared to answer, made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of trying to address the specific allegations Jasmine had raised, he chose to attack her authority to question him at all. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice now openly hostile, "what you're doing here today represents a dangerous attack on the independence of the federal judiciary. The separation of powers that protects our constitutional system depends on each branch of government respecting the other's legitimate authority." It was a desperate gambit, wrapping himself in constitutional principle while avoiding the substance of the corruption allegations. But Jasmine was ready for it. "Mr. Chief Justice," she replied, her voice calm but implacable, "the separation of powers also requires each branch to provide appropriate oversight of the others. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress explicit authority to oversee the conduct of federal judges, including the power of impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors." She pulled out what appeared to be a constitutional law textbook, marked with dozens of sticky notes. In fact, the founders specifically designed the impeachment power as a check on judicial corruption. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 81 that federal judges would be subject to removal for deliberate usurpations on the authority of the legislature. Roberts tried to interrupt, but Jasmine continued without pause. "Based on the evidence I've presented today, you have not only violated federal ethics laws, but you have usurped legislative authority by coordinating with outside groups to influence court decisions. You have turned the Supreme Court from an independent judicial body into what appears to be a partisan political operation." The accusation hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Jasmine had just accused the Chief Justice of the United States of treason against the constitutional system he was sworn to uphold. "Furthermore," she continued, "your repeated attacks on my qualifications to ask these questions demonstrate exactly the kind of arrogance and contempt for democratic accountability that has allowed this corruption to flourish." She stood up from her chair, a gesture that somehow made her seem taller and more authoritative than the Chief Justice sitting at the witness table. "Mr. Chief Justice, you seem to believe that your position makes you immune from scrutiny, that your authority is beyond question, that the American people should simply trust you to police yourself. But the evidence shows that this trust has been catastrophically misplaced." Roberts, who had spent the entire hearing trying to maintain his composure and authority, finally cracked. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice rising to a near shout, "I will not sit here and allow you to destroy the reputation of an institution that has served this country with distinction for more than 200 years based on innuendo, speculation, and politically motivated attacks." It was exactly the kind of outburst that Jasmine had been hoping to provoke. By losing his temper, Roberts had destroyed the carefully cultivated image of judicial temperament that had protected him throughout his career. "Mr. Chief Justice," Jasmine said, her voice remaining perfectly calm, "the only person destroying the reputation of the Supreme Court is you. The evidence I've presented today isn't innuendo or speculation. It's documented proof of systematic corruption that reaches the highest levels of our judicial system." She gestured toward the pile of documents she had assembled. "Every email, every financial record, every travel receipt is real. Every allegation I've made is supported by evidence that would be admissible in any court in America. The only person making this political is you, by refusing to address the facts and instead attacking the messenger." With Roberts now visibly rattled and his authority in shambles, Jasmine prepared to deliver the final blow that would destroy not just his career, but the entire system of corruption she had spent 2 years documenting. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, reaching into her folder one last time, "there's one more document I'd like to show you." She pulled out what appeared to be an official government report, bound in the distinctive blue cover used by federal law enforcement agencies. "This is a preliminary report from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, dated 3 weeks ago. It details their ongoing investigation into influence peddling and bribery involving federal judges." Roberts' face went completely white. The existence of an FBI investigation into Supreme Court corruption was something he had hoped to keep secret, at least until after the current term ended. According to this report, Jasmine continued, the FBI has identified more than 200 instances of potential criminal conduct involving federal judges over the past decade. The investigation has already resulted in 2 arrests and is expected to produce additional indictments in the coming months. She looked directly at Roberts, whose hands were now visibly shaking. The report specifically identifies you as a subject of the investigation, Mr. Chief Justice. Federal prosecutors are currently reviewing evidence of your financial relationships with donors and your coordination with outside political groups to determine whether criminal charges are warranted. The revelation was devastating. Not only was Roberts facing congressional oversight and public exposure, but he was potentially facing criminal prosecution that could result in prison time. But perhaps most importantly, Jasmine said, the FBI report concludes that the corruption at the Supreme Court represents a threat to national security because foreign governments and hostile actors have exploited the court's lack of ethical oversight to gain influence over American judicial decisions. She held up a section of the report marked Top Secret. Federal intelligence agencies have identified at least 12 instances where foreign governments or their agents provided gifts, payments, or other benefits to Supreme Court justices in attempts to influence decisions on cases involving international law, trade disputes, and immigration policy. The implications were staggering. If foreign governments had been buying influence at the Supreme Court, it would represent not just corruption, but a fundamental compromise of American sovereignty. Mr. Chief Justice, Jasmine said, her voice now carrying the full moral authority of someone exposing treason at the highest levels of government. You have not only violated your oath of office and betrayed the public trust, you have made the Supreme Court vulnerable to foreign manipulation and hostile influence. She paused to let the weight of her words settle over the committee room. So, when you question my qualifications to hold you accountable, let me remind you that accountability is not a privilege that requires special qualifications. It's a fundamental responsibility of democratic citizenship. Roberts sat in stunned silence, his career in ruins, his reputation destroyed, facing the prospect of criminal prosecution and impeachment. The man who had walked into the hearing as one of the most powerful figures in American government was leaving as a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. The remainder of the hearing was essentially a formality. Roberts, faced with overwhelming evidence of corruption and potential criminal conduct, could do little more than invoke his right to remain silent and request legal counsel. His attempts to maintain judicial dignity had collapsed completely in the face of Jasmine's methodical presentation of evidence. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, clips of Jasmine's confrontation with Roberts were spreading across social media at viral speed. The image of the Chief Justice of the United States being systematically dismantled by a first-term Congresswoman became one of the most shared political videos in social media history. Cable news networks went into overdrive, with legal experts and political analysts struggling to explain the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Constitutional scholars appeared on every major network to discuss the implications of the corruption allegations and the potential for judicial impeachment proceedings. The reaction from legal professionals was swift and unforgiving. The American Bar Association issued an emergency statement calling for Roberts's immediate resignation. Law school deans across the country signed an open letter demanding congressional action to address the Supreme Court's ethical crisis. Even some conservative legal scholars who had long defended Roberts and the court's conservative majority found themselves unable to justify the evidence that Jasmine had presented. The corruption was simply too extensive, too well documented to explain away or dismiss. Perhaps most significantly, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit announced that they were expanding their investigation into Supreme Court ethics violations and would be seeking additional search warrants and subpoenas. The prospect of federal law enforcement agencies investigating the highest court in the land represented an unprecedented crisis in American governance. The political ramifications of Jasmine's exposure of Supreme Court corruption extended far beyond the judicial branch. Within 48 hours of the hearing, congressional leaders from both parties were calling for emergency hearings on judicial reform and accountability. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that the House would immediately begin drafting articles of impeachment against Roberts and potentially other Supreme Court justices involved in the corruption scandal. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called for the creation of a special committee to investigate the full scope of judicial misconduct. Even some Republican leaders, faced with evidence that was impossible to ignore, began distancing themselves from Roberts and calling for accountability. Senator Susan Collins, whose vote was often decisive on judicial matters, declared that the allegations were deeply troubling and warranted thorough investigation and appropriate consequences. The Supreme Court itself was thrown into chaos. Associate justices who had long operated under Roberts' leadership found themselves scrambling to distance themselves from the corruption scandal. Several justices hired personal attorneys, and there were reports of heated discussions about whether Roberts should step down voluntarily to avoid further damage to the court's reputation. Legal experts began discussing scenarios that had seemed unthinkable just days before. The possibility of impeaching multiple Supreme Court justices, the potential for criminal prosecutions of sitting judges, and the need for fundamental reforms to judicial oversight and accountability. As the dust settled from Jasmine's devastating presentation, the broader implications of what she had revealed began to sink in across American political and legal circles. This wasn't just about one corrupt Chief Justice. It was about a systematic breakdown of judicial ethics and accountability that had been building for years. Ethics experts who reviewed the evidence Jasmine had presented concluded that the corruption at the Supreme Court was worse than anything they had previously documented. The combination of undisclosed gifts, coordinated political activities, and family financial benefits created what one expert called the most comprehensive breach of judicial ethics in American history. The revelation that foreign governments had potentially influenced Supreme Court decisions through gifts and payments to justices raised national security concerns that went far beyond traditional corruption issues. Intelligence agencies began reviewing past court decisions to determine whether any might have been influenced by foreign interference. Perhaps most troubling was the evidence of coordination between the court and outside political groups. If justices were working with activists to influence public opinion and coordinate legal strategies, it suggested that the court had abandoned any pretense of judicial independence and had become a partisan political institution. The American people, who had long viewed the Supreme Court as above politics, were forced to confront the reality that their highest court had been thoroughly corrupted by money, influence, and political calculation. Public trust in the judicial system, already declining, collapsed to historic lows. Facing the complete destruction of his reputation and the prospect of criminal prosecution, John Roberts made one final attempt to salvage his position and restore some measure of dignity to his legacy. 3 days after the devastating congressional hearing, he called a rare press conference at the Supreme Court. Standing behind the podium in the court's public information office, Roberts looked every one of his 69 years. The confidence and authority that had characterized his entire career had been replaced by visible exhaustion and defeat. "I want to address the serious allegations that have been made about my conduct and the conduct of this court," he began, his voice lacking its usual strength and certainty. "While I categorically deny any intentional wrongdoing, I recognize that some of my actions may have created appearances that were inconsistent with the highest ethical standards." It was a carefully worded statement that attempted to acknowledge problems without admitting criminal conduct, but it was too little, too late. The evidence Jasmine had presented was too comprehensive, too well documented to be explained away by claims of innocent mistakes. "I have always tried to serve this court and the American people with integrity and dedication," Roberts continued. "If my actions have fallen short of the standards that the American people have a right to expect, I take full responsibility for those failures." But even his attempt at taking responsibility felt hollow, given the overwhelming evidence of deliberate misconduct that Jasmine had revealed. The idea that millions of dollars in undisclosed gifts and coordination with political activists could be dismissed as innocent errors strained credibility beyond the breaking point. Roberts announced that he would be recusing himself from all cases involving political or ethical issues while the various investigations proceeded. He also promised to implement new ethical guidelines for the court, though critics noted that his promises carried little weight given his compromised position. The press conference, rather than helping Roberts, only reinforced the impression that he was a man whose time in power had come to an end. His halting delivery, defensive tone, and inability to directly address the most serious allegations made it clear that his authority as Chief Justice had been irreparably damaged. 6 months after that historic hearing in room 216 of the Hart Senate Office Building, the American judicial system looked fundamentally different. John Roberts had resigned as Chief Justice under the threat of impeachment, becoming the first Supreme Court justice to step down due to corruption allegations. The FBI's investigation had expanded to include multiple federal judges and had resulted in the largest judicial corruption prosecution in American history. Several Supreme Court justices faced ongoing criminal investigations, and the court's reputation had been so damaged that some legal experts questioned whether it could continue to function effectively. Congress had passed the most comprehensive judicial reform legislation in decades, establishing mandatory financial disclosure requirements, prohibiting certain types of gifts and travel, and creating an independent oversight body to monitor judicial conduct. The legislation was widely known as the Crockett Reforms, named after the congresswoman whose courage had exposed the corruption. For Jasmine, the aftermath brought both satisfaction and soberness. She had succeeded in exposing corruption at the highest levels of government, but the process had also revealed how deeply compromised American institutions had become. In interviews following Roberts' resignation, Jasmine was characteristically modest about her role in the transformation of American judicial oversight. "I didn't set out to destroy anyone's career or bring down the Supreme Court," she told reporters. "I simply believed that the American people deserved to know the truth about how their judicial system was really operating." But she was also clear about the broader implications of what had been revealed. This case showed that no one is above accountability, not even the Chief Justice of the United States. When we allow powerful people to operate without oversight, when we treat titles and positions as shields against scrutiny, we invite the kind of corruption that undermines democratic institutions. The hearing had also established Jasmine as one of the most effective congressional oversight specialists in Washington. Her methodical approach to building cases and her ability to present complex evidence in compelling ways made her a sought-after voice on issues of government accountability and ethics. The committee room where it all happened still hosts congressional hearings, but visitors often ask about the day when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took down the Chief Justice of the United States with nothing but evidence and moral clarity. Tour guides tell them about the moment when John Roberts made the fatal mistake of questioning Jasmine's qualifications, not knowing that she had spent 2 years building an airtight case that would expose the biggest corruption scandal in judicial history. They talk about the documents that revealed systematic ethical violations and the evidence that showed foreign governments had potentially influenced Supreme Court decisions. But they always end their tours with a reminder. Democracy depends not just on institutions and laws, but on individuals willing to hold those institutions accountable when they fail to live up to their responsibilities. The question Roberts had posed, whether Jasmine was qualified to evaluate judicial ethics, had been answered definitively, but it had also raised a more important question. Who watches the watchers, and what happens when they stop watching themselves? The answer, as 27 million Americans learned that day, is that sometimes it takes just one person with the courage and preparation to speak truth to power, regardless of how powerful that person might be. It took exactly 5 minutes and 31 seconds for Jasmine Crockett to expose 18 years of judicial corruption and trigger the biggest constitutional crisis in modern American history. But the impact of those 5 minutes would be felt for generations, as a reminder that in a democracy, no one, not even the Chief Justice of the United States, is above accountability. The manila folder that Jasmine had carried into that hearing room was empty now, its contents having served their purpose in holding power accountable and restoring some measure of integrity to American institutions. But its legacy would live on in the understanding that democracy requires eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or wealth, but with documents, evidence, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. John Roberts had questioned Jasmine's qualifications to hold him accountable. In response, she had shown him, and the world, exactly what accountability looked like. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.